All right, good evening, First Baptist Church. How are y'all doing this evening? Oh, well, hey, that's not too bad. All right, if you would stand. We're going to sing a couple of songs. My voice is still a little rough, so y'all are going to have to sing out. I stand amazed in the presence of Jesus the Nazarene, and wonder how he could love me, a sinner condemned, unclean.
All right, thank you, ladies and men. Good to see everybody tonight. Turn to Judges. We're going through the book of Judges, as you know. We're in chapter 10 and 11 tonight. Chapter 10 is a very short chapter, and it's a part of the narrative or the story that's in chapter 11. So we're going to look at both chapters tonight. Words have meaning, and words are very powerful, and sometimes words can hurt others, and sometimes it can cost their lives. This is one of the most heartbreaking stories in the Bible tonight, certainly in the Old Testament, and we're going to look at that this evening. Now, there's some good news from the story. There's some victories as well, but we'll look at both the good and the bad. Judges chapter 10, verse 1. Again, Judges chapter 10 and chapter 11. Verse 1. After the time of Abimelech, a man of Issachar, Tola, the son of Puah, which Tola is an interesting name. Puah is even more interesting name, but Puah was the son of who? Dodo, D-O-D-O. And so Tola could say, my granddad is a Dodo, and he'd be right, that's his name. Rose to save Israel. I don't know of another person in the Bible named Dodo, or Tola, or Puah, for that matter. By the way, after the time of Abimelech, do you remember Abimelech? He was a bad dude. He killed his 70 brothers. Well, keep that in mind. His mother was, do you remember? It was, I believe, a concubine, and we later find out was a prostitute. Keep that in mind as well. So this is Abimelech. After the Abimelech, this is Tola, who's the son of Puah, the son of Dodo, rose to save Israel. He lived in Shamir in the hill country of Ephraim. He led Israel 23 years. Then he died and was buried in Shamir. He was followed by Jair of Gilead, who led Israel 22 years. He had the number for tonight is 30, by the way. He had 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys. They controlled 30 towns in Gilead, which to this day are called Havoth Jair. When Jair died, he was buried in Kaman. So 30 sons who rode 30 donkeys and ruled 30 cities. I'm fascinated by the fact that they put that in there. The donkey part especially, why they felt a need, the writer or the good Lord decided to let us know that they rode donkeys. Every one of them. I don't know, I've not seen a lot of people riding donkeys. I don't know if there's 30 of them riding donkeys, if that's somehow more intimidating. But I'm just amazed that they got 30 donkeys to go in the same direction. Anyway, verse 6, again the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Back to the theme really of the book and this cyclical pattern they had. They served the Baals of the Ashtoreths, then the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of the Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsook the Lord and no longer served him, he became angry with them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan in Gilead, the land of the Amorites. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to fight against Judah, Benjamin, and the house of Ephraim. And Israel was in great distress. Now that last statement kind of summarizes all that has happened. They sinned against God. God gave them over to the enemy, and now they are in distress. For how many years have they been in distress? 18 years. That's correct. Verse 10. Then, which is interesting, then the Israelites cried out to the Lord. I find that interesting because it took 18 years of misery before they finally cried out to God. I just find that interesting. They cried out to the Lord, "We have sinned against you, forsaking our God and serving the Baals." So God has now given them an attitude adjustment. But listen to the response of God in verse 11. The Lord replied, "When the Egyptians, the Amorites, the Ammonites, the Philistines, the Sidonians, the Amalekites, and the Maonites oppressed you, and you cried to me for help, did I not save you from their hands? But you have forsaken me and served other gods." so I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you're in trouble. God had given Israel victory over 7 different nations. But now Israel was worshiping 7 different variations of pagan gods. Now, what's bizarre about that is God is the one that gave them victory. So God obviously has more power than the foreign gods, because if the foreign gods were real and they had more power, then they would have overtaken the Israelites. So the Israelites know from experience that their God is a greater God than any of the others, and yet they forsake the real God and go after these gods from these conquered nations. So it's pretty bizarre. How dumb do you have to be to worship the gods of your defeated enemies? Because obviously these gods are inferior. In fact, they're non-existent. So for the people to abandon God was one thing, but for God to abandon his people is another matter altogether. When I read that a while ago, and I remember this week studying this passage, I had to read that part twice, where God says to them, no, I'm done. Now, you don't ever want to hear that from God, but he doesn't say that often. It's pretty substantial for him to make that kind of statement. So for him to abandon his people, and he really is just allowing them to go their own way because they've decided to abandon God. The greatest judgment God can send to his people is to let them have their own way and not interfere. I never really thought about that. The biggest judgment God could really give to us is just to let us go on our own way, because we're going to be miserable, unhappy, oppressed. We're going to be wallowing in our sin, and our life will be empty. Remember in Romans chapter 1, it uses these terms, wherefore God also gave them up. God gave them up. God gave them over. If you go back to that passage, it's talking about those people who abandoned God and followed after their own lusts and their own flesh. And God says in the midst of their sin, there was this point to where he just gave them over into their sin. And they reaped in their life the result of their sin. So you don't want to ever hear God abandoning us or God giving us over to our sin. Verse 15, but the Israelites said to the Lord, we have sinned. Do with us whatever you think best, but please rescue us now. Now, what are they actually saying to God here? Do what? Yeah, they're actually saying, if you want to kill us, okay, could it be later on? Right now, we really appreciate if you'd rescue us. It's just an odd thing. Yeah, they're actually saying, do with us whatever you think is best, but please rescue us now. Then they got rid of by the way, the word then really stuns me. They've come to God, and now twice they've acknowledged that they've sinned, and they're asking God for mercy, but they still haven't gotten rid of the foreign gods. When they make this request, they still have them. It was only after they make the request, it says in verse 16, then they got rid of the foreign gods among them and served the Lord. And listen to this part. It's a beautiful sentence. And he could bear Israel's misery no longer. God made it very clear that there was justice and there was a limit to where he was not going to help them anymore. But obviously, God also loves his people. And he heard their misery, and he just couldn't take it anymore. Verse 17, when the Ammonites were called to arms and camped in Gilead, the Israelites assembled and camped at Mizpah. The leaders of the people of Gilead said to each other, whoever will launch the attack against the Ammonites will be the head of all those living in Gilead. Now that tells us what? Nobody's in charge. They have nobody to fight for them. They have no leader. And so they basically put out a memo to all the area saying, hey, you want to be in charge? No problem. Help us defeat these enemies. Chapter 11, verse 1. Jephthah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior. Remember, that's what the angel said to Gideon. He called Gideon a mighty warrior. Here it just says matter-of-factly that Jephthah was a mighty warrior. Jephthah is aware of it, and apparently everybody else is aware of it as well. Again, just FYI, Jephthah is one of the most heartbreaking, gut-wrenching characters in the Bible. His father, in the latter part of verse 1, his father was Gilead, which makes sense because Jephthah was a Gileadite, apparently named after dad. His mother was a what? A prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons. And so he had a wife with kids, and then he had Jephthah from a prostitute, so he's an illegitimate son. And verse 2, and when they were grown up, they drove Jephthah away. You're not going to get any inheritance in our family, they said, because you are the son of another woman. So Jephthah fled from his brothers and settled in the land of Tob, where a group of adventurers gathered around him and followed him. Again, I love the terminology. So we know that Jephthah is a mighty warrior, and now he's got a group of adventurers, a bunch of tough guys hanging around him because he's fled from his brothers who wanted nothing to do with him. Now, here's what's important in this story so far. While Jephthah is a mighty warrior, his brothers that ran him off weren't. While Jephthah is a brave man, his brothers weren't. In fact, the people weren't. Verse 4. Sometime later, when the Ammonites made war on Israel, the elders of Gilead went to get Jephthah. They didn't go to the brothers, they went to Jephthah from the land of Tob. Come, they said, be our commander so we can fight the Ammonites. Jephthah said to them, didn't you hate me and drive me from my father's house? Why do you come to me now when you're in trouble? Again, this sounds just like a Netflix series. So he runs off, they run him out of town on a rail, and then later when they need a warrior, they go and said, hey, why don't you come help us? Verse 8, the elders of Gilead said to him, nevertheless, we're turning to you now. Now, what does nevertheless mean? Yeah, okay, you're right, we ran you off, so we're turning to you now. That's in the past. Come with us to fight. I mean, that's really gutsy, by the way, because he's the only brave guy in the land. And they go to the brave guy and say, yeah, we ran you off, but we need your help now. Come with us to fight the Ammonites, and you will be our head over all who live in Gilead. Now, they use the word head here. What does that kind of sound like? It kind of sounds like a king. They don't say the word king, but they're basically saying, you'll be the guy. You'll be the leader. You'll be in charge of us. Verse 9, Jephthah, who apparently, for some crazy reason, doesn't trust them, said or answered, suppose you take me back to fight the Ammonites and the Lord gives them to me. Will I really be your head? The elders of Gilead replied, the Lord is our witness. Now, I find that comical. They swear on the name of the Lord is our witness, because these are the people that have spent years and years and years abandoning the Lord, and now they call the Lord as their witness. So I'm not sure I put a lot of credibility in that. They said, the Lord is our witness. We will certainly do as you say. So Jephthah went with the elders of Gilead, and the people made him head and commander over them. And he repeated all his words before the Lord in Mizpah. So he makes it very clear to everybody, this is the deal, this is the arrangement, this is what's going to happen. Verse 12. So far, so good, by the way. Then Jephthah sent messengers to the Ammonite king with the question, what do you have against us that you have attacked our country? The king of the Ammonites answered Jephthah's messengers. When Israel came up out of Egypt, this is the response of the kings. When Israel came up out of Egypt, they took away my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok and all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peacefully. Jephthah sent back messengers to the Ammonite king saying this, and here's his reply. This is what Jephthah says. Israel did not take the land of Moab or the land of the Ammonites, But when they came up out of Egypt, Israel went through the desert to the Red Sea on to Kadesh. Then Israel sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, "Give us permission to go through your country." But the king of Edom would not listen. They sent also to the king of Moab, and he refused. So Israel stayed at Kadesh. Next, they traveled through the desert, skirted the lands of Edom and Moab, passed along the eastern side of the country of Moab, and camped on the other side of the Arnon. So he says, we weren't in your country, we were right by it. It says, for the Arnon was its border. Verse 19, then Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, who ruled in Heshbon, and said to him, let us pass through your country to our own place. So he's giving them a history lesson because the Ammonite kings have said to him, you took our land, it's time to give it back, okay? That's fair, it belonged to us. And so he's giving them a history lesson of what actually happened. He said, actually, no, we went to 3 kingdoms and we asked them, will you let us just pass through? All 3 of them said, nope. But these guys, Ammonites, went one step further. Look at verse 20. So verse 19, let us pass through your country to our own place. So verse 20, Sihon, however, did not trust Israel to pass through his territory. He mustered all of his men and encamped at Jahaz and fought with Israel. Then the Lord, the God of Israel, gave Sihon and all of his men to Israel in Israel's hands, and they defeated them. Israel took over all the land of the Amorites who lived in that country, capturing all of it from the Arnon to the Jabbok and from the desert to the Jordan. Now, since the Lord, the God of Israel, has driven the Amorites out before his people, Israel, what right have you to take it over? That's a pretty good argument, is it not? Verse 24, will you not take what your God, Chemosh, gives you? Likewise, whatever the Lord our God has given us, we will possess. So he makes it very clear. First of all, we weren't the aggressor. We didn't want war with you. We didn't want to attack you. And this is east of the Jordan. If you remember, the land of Canaan, the promised land, was west of the Jordan. And Israel today is west of the Jordan. What's east of the Jordan? Jordan. Trick question. The country of Jordan's east of the Jordan. Israel is west of the Jordan. And so they were on the east side of the Jordan just to get through so they could go on the west side and start conquering the Holy Land. And so he responds to this king and says, actually, we weren't going to go to war with you. We had no interest in you or your land. We wanted to get through to the other land, to the land of Canaan, so we could conquer it. And the only reason we conquered you guys is because you attacked us. And God gave us your land, and because our God gave us your land, you're just out of luck. So, now, one interesting note here, the God, what's the name of the God that they serve? Yeah, Chemosh. Now, I looked up articles on that God, and the truth is we're not really sure what this God looked like. Every God looked like something except the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's the only one that has no form. All of their gods were idols and had forms. So there are some that think this was a fish god, and so he has a fish head. Others have him with horns, kind of looking kind of like the devil. We're not really sure, but we do know this much about Chemosh. Solomon this is, by the way, I got this from Wikipedia. Solomon is said to have built a sanctuary to Chemosh on the Mount of Olives. We find that out in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 7, which was maintained till the reform of Josiah in 2 Kings. Is that not interesting? So Solomon, and Wikipedia says it this way, this movement by Solomon was no doubt to some extent a political one, but it made the worship of Chemosh a part of the religious life of Israel for nearly 400 years. So while you and I have never heard of this God, this false God, it apparently was a substantial presence in Israel for centuries. In fact, that God had a presence because of Solomon officially in Israel for far longer than the United States has been a country. Long time. Verse 25. Are you better than Balak, son of Zippor, king of Moab? Did he ever quarrel with Israel or fight with them? For 300 years, Israel occupied Heshbon, Ar, and the surrounding settlements and all the towns along the Arnon. Why didn't you retake them during that time? I have not wronged you, but you're wronging me. Or you're doing me wrong by waging war against me. Let the Lord, the judge, decide the dispute this day between the Israelites and the Ammonites. The king of Ammon, however, paid no attention to the message that Jephthah sent him. Now here's what you can glean from this. Before declaring war, Jephthah did try peacefully to negotiate with the Ammonites. He didn't just rush out to war. He tried to settle the matter. But the negotiations failed. But nevertheless, this section does tell us two things about Jephthah. Number one, he knew the scriptures. He didn't go to his advisors and say, okay, what happened? Could you refresh me on what happened? He knew what had happened. He knew his own history in his country, and he knew his scriptures. And number two, he was not a hothead who was looking for a fight. He could have just stormed right out there. Samson would have just stormed right out, for example. But he at least tried to negotiate. Being a military man himself, Jephthah knew that a war could result in thousands of Jewish men being killed, and he wanted to avoid that if possible. Verse 29, then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. I always like that when I hear that in Judges, in the Bible. The Spirit of the Lord came. Something good about to happen. The Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah of Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And so far, so good. And then there's verse 30. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. If you give the Ammonites into my hands, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me when I return in triumph from the Ammonites will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Now, I don't know if that's the stupidest statement or dumbest vow ever made, but it's got to be right up there. We'll see why in a minute. Have you ever made a vow to God? Are you married? Then you have. Are you a Christian? Then you have. Have you ever made a vow to God? Well, let me give you a couple of suggestions if you're going to make a vow to God, whether marriage or to become a Christian or whatever vow you may make to God. Number one, be very careful and mindful about the vow that you're going to make to God. Don't ever, in an impromptu moment, a moment of spontaneity, spout out to God some vow. Take it seriously, and so you need to think it through. Number two, this is my personal belief. God does not honor stupid vows. And no, you cannot claim your marriage as a stupid vow or justification for getting out of it. But God does not expect us to do bad things in His name in order to honor a vow that He didn't make to us, but that we made to Him. I don't think God wanted anything to do with this vow. Number three, I told you two things. There are three. No, there are four. I mean four. Number three, God does not bless vows that go against His word. That goes without saying, but I thought I needed to say it. Number four, I wanted to tell you, I once knew someone. Now, I've had people tell me over the years that they've made a vow to God to do this or to that, or to go there or go here, to go on a mission trip or to do this or that. But I knew someone once, many years ago, that made a vow to God that was so radical that in the end it cost him his marriage and it dissolved his family. And what I wanted to say to him was, you made a vow to God when you got married, and you can't make a subsequent vow to God that negates the first vow that you made. God will never honor that, because no matter what he does now, he's got to break a vow. So he broke the vows of his marriage, and his life just plummeted. I was heartbroken to see it unfold because I knew God would never honor that vow. Verse 32, Then Jephthah went over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gave them into his hands. And by the way, God gave them into his hands, we know, because God had already planned to do that. That's why the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He didn't need to make that vow. He already had the Spirit of the Lord upon him. Verse 33, he devastated 20 towns from Aor to the vicinity of Minnith, as far as Abel Keramim. Thus Israel subdued Ammon. When Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of tambourines? She was an only child. Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh, my daughter, you have made me miserable and wretched because I have made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me just as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request," she said. "Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." "You may go," he said, and he let her go for 2 months. She and the girls went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. After the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her as he had vowed, and she was a virgin. From this comes the Israelite custom that each year the young women of Israel go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite. Now, I'm going to share with you one of the theologians that I often quote, Warren Wiersbe, and he has a lot to say about this. I just gleaned some of the things that he said, but I'll tell you before I read it, he's not alone, he is so distraught by the questions that this passage brings up that he cannot allow himself as a theologian to conclude that he actually sacrificed his own daughter. He goes on to contend, and I'm not going to read it, it's a big long section. He goes on to contend that he thinks that he gave his daughter over to the temple to be raised in the temple, kind of like Samuel was. But the problem with that is, the indication is there's a burnt offering, and it's the daughter. I hope he's right. It doesn't actually say that he burned her on the altar or she was killed or anything like that, but I find it unlikely that for centuries and centuries and centuries later, the Israelites would develop a custom for every year for the young women to go out for 4 days to commemorate the daughter of Jephthah if she was dedicated to the Lord at the temple or the tabernacle. Does that make sense? It just didn't. I wanted to work in, and he wanted to work in there so bad that he just concluded that there's no way he could have killed his daughter, but it was very common practice, sadly, at the time. But he does list several perplexing questions, and so I want to share these questions with you tonight. Number one, he says this: the more you study Jephthah's vow, the more puzzling it becomes. He simply could have said, "Lord, if you help me defeat the enemy, when I get home, I'll offer you a generous burnt offering." But he couched his vow in ambiguous terms. How did he know who or what would come out of the door of his house? What if the first thing to greet him happened to be an unclean animal that was unacceptable to God? Then he couldn't fulfill his vow. The Hebrew word translated whatsoever or whatever is masculine and suggests that he expected to meet a person. But what if that person turned out to be a neighbor's child or a total stranger? What right did Jephthah have to take either life and thereby offer to God a sacrifice that cost him nothing? I can tell you this, surely, because of his reaction when he goes home and his daughter comes out, he obviously didn't expect his daughter to be the one to come out the door. I don't know if he thought she was staying with a friend down the street, or they have a pet dog that he thought would run out. We don't know what he thought, but obviously, surely he's not, because he was shocked and horrified when she came out the door. And so he's expecting something else to happen. And Warren Wiersbe poses the question, well, what if something else had happened? What if it's another person? or somebody else's daughter. Would that be okay? Or an unclean animal comes out. Well, he can't do that. God wouldn't honor that. So what an odd thing to say. Why would he say such a thing to God? And I can tell you, while I can't answer the question, I can tell you human nature, and I can tell you I've never said anything this foolish to God, but over the years, I've made requests in my prayers that weren't wise. I want God to do all kinds of things that don't honor him. We give God a list, especially when I was young. I would ask God for all kinds of dumb things. And so we have to be very careful when we go to God with requests. You know, they always say, be careful what you ask for because you might just get it. Furthermore, Warren Wiersbe goes on to say, surely Jephthah knew that Jehovah didn't approve or accept of human sacrifices. It was forbidden for the Israelites. Everybody else did it, but not the Israelites. Jephthah gave evidence of familiarity with the Old Testament scriptures when he wrote that other king, and he would have known about Abraham and Isaac in Genesis 22 and the commandments of the law in Leviticus 18 and 20. Deuteronomy chapter 12, Deuteronomy chapter 18. He knew that offering a human sacrifice to God was forbidden. What a bizarre thing to say to God. He goes on to say, granted, the period of the judges was a spiritually dark era in Israel's history, and the Jews did many things that were wrong. But it's doubtful that Jephthah's friends and neighbors would have permitted him to slay his own daughter in order to fulfill a foolish vow. King Saul's soldiers didn't let him kill his own son Jonathan, who had violated his father's foolish vow in 1 Samuel chapter 14. And where would Jephthah offer his daughter as a sacrifice? Surely he knew that the Lord accepted sacrifices only at the tabernacle altar. That's from Leviticus 17. You can't just make a sacrifice anywhere. And that they had to be offered by the Levitical priests. People didn't all make their own sacrifices, offer their own sacrifices. The priests did that always. So he's not even qualified to offer a sacrifice, even if it was their pet dog, let alone his daughter. In fact, if people knew that Jephthah was going to Shiloh to slay his daughter, that's where the tabernacle was, or a tabernacle was there, they probably would have stopped him along the way and kidnapped the girl. A national hero like Jephthah couldn't easily hide what he was doing, and surely the story would have spread quickly among the people during the 2-month waiting period. Even if he made it safely to Shiloh, Jephthah could have learned from any priest that paying the proper amount of money could have redeemed his daughter. That's from Leviticus chapter 27. As a successful soldier who had just returned from looting the enemy, Jephthah could have easily paid the redemption price. No other pertinent questions arise. In spite of Numbers chapter 30, verse 1 and 2, would God take seriously a vow that violated both human rights and divine law? Would a spirit-empowered man, and he was empowered by the Holy Spirit of God, committed to the Lord, who was committed to the Lord, even make such a ridiculous vow? So again, I want to believe that his questions bring about the conclusion that he didn't sacrifice his daughter, but I can't help but to take the word of God for what it says, and it certainly suggests to me that he did just that terrible thing. And again, it was a common practice at the time. It tells me this much. Our sins and our careless words have collateral damage. We have to be very careful about what we say. I enjoy watching The Chosen because I enjoy watching the words of Jesus and hearing the words of Jesus. Jesus never said anything stupid. Never. We say dumb things all the time. He never said anything that later on he thought about it and goes, oh man, I should apologize. Or I can't believe I said that. I was just mad at those Pharisees and I just let them have it. Never. He had zero regrets. Everything he said was wise and sinless. And that tells me that you and I should strive toward that mark. Now, for most of us, for most of us, men and women, a lot of that can be resolved. A lot of the foolish things that I say can be resolved just by talking less. We talk too much, I think, at the wrong times about the wrong subjects. We get upset, we get frustrated, we become angry, and we end up saying things that we think, oh, I shouldn't have said that. God begins to convict us of that. But our careless words definitely have collateral damage. If you ever studied raising children, or if you ever raised children, it is extraordinary how powerful words are in sculpting the personality of our children. How for all of their life they can harbor something in their hearts that we said and we forgot about it 5 minutes later, but they never got over it. Words are powerful, so be careful what you say this week. All right, any thoughts or questions as we conclude our Bible study? Yes? Yes, But go ahead, I'm sorry.
So I'm trying to think in my mind is like you said, you hope he didn't actually kill it, it was a burnt offering.
Yeah.
Well, I would think that if God stopped Abraham before he actually killed his son, he would do the same.
There's a huge difference between those two stories because with Abraham, God was the one that told him to do it. Okay. With Jephthah, the idea came from Jephthah. So what God does is always perfect because he's God. And what Jephthah did was just spout out because he didn't think it through very well. And so there's a big difference because the directives came from flawed man and from perfect God. But God never had, as we know, any intention of harming Isaac.
So if he hadn't done it, would God have taken offense to him?
Ask me in 100 years and I'll tell you. I don't know what God would have done had he not done it. I really don't. That's a fair question, but I don't know. No, we didn't know that. All right, any other questions? It's a perplexing story. There's no way around it. All right, let's take a look at our prayer sheet for the week. Yes. Oh, yes. Well, I don't think it was a temple. It was a tabernacle. If it was a temple, then it was a pagan temple. But it would have been a tabernacle. So the altar was not in the tabernacle. It was in front of the tabernacle. And so all of the animal sacrifices that were made were actually outdoors. It was all outdoors. Now, what right, so Warren Wiersbe is making that suggestion. He's also making the suggestion that he took his daughter to the tabernacle in order to make the sacrifice. But had he taken her or an animal or anything else to the tabernacle, the priest would have done the sacrifice and the priest wouldn't have done it. So that's where I probably disagree with Warren Wiersbe. I don't think he took her to the tabernacle or anywhere else. I think he went right outside his house and he did it. That's my guess. So, all right, interesting. Anybody else? All right, let's look at our prayer sheet for the week.